Hello, buongiorno, everyone. Benvenuti to our third appointment with the Rome Book Club, Lenten Music Through the Ages. For those of you joining today for the first time, my name is Silvia Dall'Olio, and I serve as the Executive Director here at the University of Notre Dame Rome Global Gateway. As always, it is a pleasure to be accompanied in this journey by Dr. J.J. Wright, Director of the Notre Dame Folk Choir. Together, we would like to take a moment at this time to thank all the co-sponsors of the Lenten Music Through the Ages series, the Notre Dame Folk Choir, Sacred Music at Notre Dame, the Center for Italian Studies, and the Notre Dame Alumni Association. During our second meeting last week, Dr. Wright and his guests discussed Renaissance polyphony, as well as the special place that children have in liturgical music. Today, instead, we will learn about Baroque music, the music that was developed between the late 16th and early 17th centuries. To help us understand and appreciate this wonderful music, together with J.J. Wright, we are honored to have Dr. Patrick Kronner, who serves as organist and choral program director at the University of Notre Dame, as well as directs the Magnificat choir, formerly known as the Women's Liturgical Choir, and the Community Choir. Thank you, Dr. Croner, for being with us today. If any of the participants have questions for our faculty, as always, please use the Google form that we're sharing with you right now. We'll try to respond to as many questions as possible, but if we don't get to them all, please know that we have a private moderated discussion board on LinkedIn to continue the discussion. As in previous appointments, we will have a 15-minute breakout session so that you can continue to meet each other and discuss today's topic in smaller groups. We will hold these breakouts at the end of the formal portion of the program. Should you not wish to break out, you may choose to leave the meeting at that time, as we will not be reconvening after the community circle breakout. A few pre-recorded videos, as those of you who have been with us before certainly would know. A few pre-recorded videos, audio listenings, and articles are posted on the Think and View website, with JJ discussing a few themes from the topic of today. Now, with no further ado, JJ, please take it from here with your guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Wonderful to be with you all this afternoon. Good afternoon. Thanks, of course, to the Rome Global Gateway and to the Alumni Association for helping facilitate such a wonderful event here. I'm thrilled today to be joined by my colleague, Dr. Patrick Croner. He is, as Sylvia said, the director of the Magnificat choir, formerly known as the Women's Liturgical Choir. Also a friend of mine and a wonderful organist, choir director, of course, musician, scholar, thinker. He's got it all. And today, Patrick is armed with instruments. You'll see the organ behind him there. We're actually in the same building on the same floor. He's just across the hall, and normally Patrick's office is right next to mine here. So I'm thrilled to have Patrick here, and we're really excited today. We're gonna shake it up a little bit and kind of get into a little bit more music, thanks to Patrick's excitement. So thanks again, Patrick, for being here, and let's jump right in.
Yeah, JJ, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. JJ and I thought before we start talking about the music, I've got this nice little organ here, courtesy of Paul Fritz, American organ builder. It's in a Baroque style. So since we're talking about Baroque music today, I thought, first of all, I'll just play a couple quick clips from some pieces so you can get the whole sound world in your head. So I'm just gonna play 3 really brief, like 10-second clips. The first one is by Bach. I think you'll recognize it. The second one is by François Couperin, a French composer, a little earlier than Bach. And then the third one is by Handel, and I think you'll recognize that one as well. So I'll move on to the organ bench, and I'll just play 3 really short 10-second clips before we start talking a bit. So here I go. that was a little bit from France, and now we'll go over to England and have some George Frederick Handel.
All right. Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah,
This is so exciting. Yeah, because we get to, this brings up a couple things right off the bat that we'll get into more as we have our conversation. But the clarity of the themes is a big thing compared to Renaissance music. Last week, we had all these interweaving lines that kind of were hiding behind each other and coming to the forefront. We heard the Bach toccata in D minor, very clear theme. Da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dum. The next thing we heard was the Couperin that he played, very, very clear melody that he played with his right hand. The chords and the pedals were the accompaniment underneath. So again, very, very clear melody. And then the Handel, of course, big block homophonic chords that are carrying the texture forward. But these are some of the main themes that we'll hope to talk about today as we go. But Patrick, let's start broad. So one of the things we talked about was what are the big forces that are at play here at the end of the 17th century going into the 18th century, or sorry, end of the 16th century going into the 17th century that are influencing this change of style, this change of taste?
Yeah, so there's lots of different things at play at this point. So again, just as a reminder, kind of the dates we're talking roughly are around 1600 to 1750, just kind of generic dates there for the Baroque period. We get the name Baroque. It was originally kind of a pejorative term. It was a Portuguese word that meant a misshapen pearl. So it's kind of referring to all these excesses that we'll see in the artwork, the ornamentation, the carvings, the paintings, everything's very excessive, very detailed. And so originally there was this kind of negative term of a misshapen pearl, Baroque, and then that's where we get the name from. So that's the time we're talking about and what we're talking about. How did all these changes come about? Like JJ mentioned, what forces were at play? There were kind of a lot of them. There were some philosophical ideas going on. There were some religious things happening, some political things happening, all at this time that contributed to the sudden change, or not, or more gradual change over this period of this new style of music. So one of the first things that was happening around 1573 was in Florence. So we're going to Italy. This is where lots of the change is happening. Italy was kind of the forefront of the Renaissance as well. And here we are back in Italy with these changes in the Baroque period. So around 1573, there's this group of luminaries and musicians, philosophers, poets, writers who get together in Florence. They became known as the Florentine Camerata. So it was a group of men who came together, mostly men. There were some women in that group as well. Barbara Strozzi was one. So some men who come together in that group to discuss philosophical ideas. Mainly, they were looking back to ancient Greece. So the idea was that this desire to emulate ancient Greek tragedies in their music. And so the way they saw Greek tragedy was they had this idea in their head that Greek tragedy was sung. It was kind of a spoken singing sort of way of doing things, which didn't really exist. You know, we're coming out of the Renaissance, as you talked about last week. We're used to choral singing with lots of different things happening at once, so text can easily get obscured, although it's very beautiful. But now there's a desire to emulate the Greeks. We want to have direct transmission of text that's really clear and really audible. And so eventually we'll talk later about how that changes musically. But that's one of the big plays. It's philosophical, just the desire to change music, to make it more direct, and that has musical results as well. JJ, anything on that?
Yeah. Who doesn't want to emulate the Greeks, right? I know Mary knows about that. But yeah, I think one of the other things I forgot to mention at the beginning, kind of our guiding principles here, is that the concept of virtuosity, which Patrick just showed us. If he kept going with that toccata, if you can recall it, there's all these really, really fast passages. And as we get into the Baroque period, this is with the rise of instrumental music, and the instrumental music kind of becoming a force of its own, kind of separate from vocal music. We also have this a different practice within the way that people practice their instruments, and that they can be flashy, they can use all of the tools that they have to try to communicate the affects of the music. So yeah, I think the last week, Patrick, we talked quite a bit about the 16th century. We talked about the Council of Trent and some of the religious motivations for what led us into the Baroque period. I wondered if we could kind of go to 1517 and maybe talk about the Reformation and what the ways in which that may have contributed to this shift.
Yeah, nice. So we'll be talking about sacred music here, of course. As I mentioned before, the idea of Greek tragedy plays into this, so these secular ideas creep in as well. But if we're thinking religious, some of obviously the big religious changes going on, happened 1517, right? Martin Luther and his 95 Theses in Germany. Of course, there were lots of other attempts before that to reform the church, but that's the real big one that takes off and gets political support in Germany and allows for these new approaches to music and faith to flourish. So one of those big things, which most of us are familiar with, of course, is the idea of the Bible in your own language, in the vernacular. So that was one of Martin Luther's big reforms, of course, was the translation of the Bible into German there. Of course, it gets eventually translated into other languages in other countries. But along with that, and kind of going hand in hand with the ideas of clarity in text in Greek dramas, comes a desire in sacred music as well to have, again, clarity of text. So in the past, we might not have necessarily understood Latin in the Catholic Mass. We would hear this beautiful polyphony that you guys talked about, all of these voices going together, creating a beautiful image of the text, but you might not necessarily always hear the text because there's a lot going on, right? But with these ideas of the Reformation, understanding and comprehension takes first place, especially in the evangelical or the Lutheran lands. So yeah, so with Luther and other reformers comes the desire to have it in the language you understand and in a clear way. And so we'll talk about this more later, but that will change how you compose music. You won't be layering music so much, and you'll be making sure the clean melody line with a clean text is present first, above all. So we'll talk about that more later, JJ. But do you want to with the next?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that it's a big deal that the scripture is translated into German, and it kind of goes right along with a lot of the same types of larger ideas that are underpinning the transition. Like if the scripture is in your own language for the first time, that means that potentially you could read the scripture yourself. So it is no longer mediated strictly through ritual, right? Which is one of the ways, of course, that we encounter scripture now, but we can open up BibleGateway.com and read any scripture we would like, but that is not always the case. So this is a huge deal in the 16th century of the invention of the printing press, and also just the ability to translate the scripture into a vernacular language. So thanks for bringing that up. But I also wanted to ask, just you spent some time in Germany, Patrick, right? And so in one of your specialties is kind of playing Baroque organ music. What was it like there in Germany? What did you learn? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to hear. So I worked at a Lutheran church over there. So you have lots of Lutheran hymns, which develop at this time with Martin Luther. And with these Lutheran hymns, you have a very clear text in a very clear rhythm that we all sing together, right? And that tradition continues even today. But as a Catholic, I also, on Saturdays, would go to the Catholic church in town there. And I'm not sure what the case is in Italy and elsewhere, but this same idea of vernacular singing of these hymns was also present today in the Catholic Church. Although it originated with the evangelical, with the Lutherans, it's there as well. So for example, for the Sanctus, the Holy Holy, it was the tradition in Germany today in the Catholic Church to sing a hymn setting of Holy Holy. So it wasn't necessarily the literal text, Sanctus, 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 Dominus. it wasn't that, it was a poetic, rhythmic German translation in the Catholic Church today.
Mm,
I found that real interesting. I didn't realize that you could even do that, so that was going on there. And it was really great to hear people all singing together strongly on these real simple melodies that have been around for 500 years. So that was amazing too. And of course, all those German organs, getting to play on the organs that Bach actually played on, it tells you a lot about the music. And the instruments, you have to play them differently,
yeah.
physically, because of the way they were built. So it informs how you would actually perform the music today on a modern organ.
Right. And that's one of the things I've appreciated most from studying the organ, the little bit that I have, is that in some ways the organ itself, the instrument itself, is the best teacher if you would like to be an organist. So the types of organs that we have and that we're able to train young organists on are very consequential in terms of how fluent a musician could be on the organ. It's a very cool thing, and it's of course present in other instruments, but you can't own an organ, right? So it's one of these things where you're to be an organist, you have to be affiliated. You have to have a mediated instrument.
Yeah.
But that's so cool. Like, just from the perspective of like ecumenism, like what's that like to go? It might be a weird concept to someone like, you're Catholic, you're a church musician, and like you go spend a year in Germany, you work at a Lutheran church, and it's not a big deal, really. What can you talk a little bit about that?
About working in a Lutheran church there?
Yeah, and like just kind of the way that like, how does that impact the way you look at your faith or something like that? I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but
Yeah, it definitely made me think about church music differently for sure. Um, there's been lots of different, schools of writing church music today in America, some more successful than others. I kind of judge what's successful with that based on how people participate. If it's music that invites people to sing and it's prayerful, it brings them into prayer, and it sets them up for success, really, to sing along and to be together. So that's kind of the two things I like to see in sacred music. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it's overly complicated. It can be very simple and direct music, and I loved seeing that when I was in Germany. At least the few Catholic churches I was in, northwestern Germany and North Rhine-Westphalia, in that area, the tradition in the Catholic Church, it was pretty simple. But I was very happy to see people of all ages singing loudly these very, very simple tunes that they knew very well, which is not always the case. If I can say, in America, we not everywhere do we have a very strong tradition in Catholic churches of singing together, for example.
right.
So that was really interesting to see, and of course there's cultural differences there, but I think the music plays into it as well. What they were singing, it was straightforward, direct, meaningful texts full of depth, that invited people to sing. It didn't require too much complicated musical knowledge, I guess. So that was really nice to experience there that I didn't really expect. So
Yeah, it's such a beautiful example of just being able to learn from what's great, and being open in your experience, and kind of letting it be additive to your own practice as a church musician. It's one of the things I really appreciate about knowing you, Patrick. So let's dive back in here. I did want to talk a little bit about Florence, and just for any of our business-minded people, just to point out that this whole happening of the Florentine Camerata, it's really the result of the Medici family, of course, and their desire to bring all of these people to Florence to think about art, to actually execute the art. And so these things, these massive movements that we're talking about, don't happen in a vacuum. And in reality, we're taking our snapshots and the videos and recording in our hour-long chats, but the much larger forces are at play that are influencing all this stuff. And so the breadth of influence is really quite astounding when you take a second to appreciate it. But if we get in a little bit to, Patrick, some of the musical brass tacks, what's different about Baroque music from Renaissance music?
yeah, so there's a lot of changes happen musically at this time, and we'll recognize these changes because Pretty much, this is kind of the beginning of music as we know it. So lots of the things that are common today in music, in popular music, even in contemporary classical music, they all kind of are formalized pretty much at this time. They develop slowly afterwards, but basically this is a big turning point as far as how we do music. Some of those things have to do, like we talked about already, the primacy of one melody line, which is then accompanied. Um, Opera, of course, Italy, that's the home of opera, and this is what develops at that time. Oratorios come as well that we'll talk about, but also the sound world, the way we use pitches, the way we use harmonies are really kind of formalized and starting to become standard now that continue today. Do you want to talk about that, JJ? I can give some
Yeah.
examples.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So if you're familiar, at least for lots of us Americans, we know The Sound of Music, Do a Deer, that song Do a Deer, a Female Deer, or solfege. If you study music, you're used to that, right? We have Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do, right? We know that sound. Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. Our modern ears are very used to that order of pitches. Those orders of notes, pretty much all modern music, all popular music, uses those notes in the same way. And our modern ears, Do, that first note I played is kind of king. All the pitches, they want to go back to Do. So if I sing Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, our modern ear probably really wants to hear Do as the next pitch, right? Or if I go down, our modern ears will do the same thing. Do, ti, la, sol, fa, mi, re. Our modern ears want to hear Do as the final pitch there. So that's what we're used to now, and that kind of starts to become common practice at this time. What came before that, which you guys might have talked about before, were the use of these church modes. So modern music, basically Do, that first pitch, that's where music wants to go. But if you listen to some Gregorian chants, for example, here's a chant melody. Da, 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 da. It's that second one JJ's pointing to there. If I sing that on the pitch names, you'll notice Do is not our central note. We don't go back to Do, we don't rest on Do. It's very different. So our ears are different in the Renaissance using these modes. These pitches here sung would be Do, Re, Fa, 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 Re. So we rest on Re. Fa, Fa, Sol, Fa. And then going on Fa, 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 Mi, Do, Re. And our ear rests on Re. So it's a different way of using these pitches. The next examples that might sound even more foreign. Our modern ears are used to Ti, is always wants to go to Do, right? But listen to this example. Ti does not go up to Do, and it kind of leaves an exotic sound to our modern ears. It starts on the pitch La. La, so, la, 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 la. There's a bunch of La's. La, la, so, ti, ti, la. We stay on La. Ti does not resolve to Do like our modern ear wants to. And then if I go to the last phrase, JJ, et in secula, we have La, so, la, 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 so, fa. Oh, I lost my spot.
So me.
There we go. So mi, and so we rest on mi. So anyways, that was the previous sound. These chants, that was what was common for centuries in our ears in the Renaissance. And then we start developing at this time our modern concept of Do being the primary note. So the cool thing about this era especially is there's a mixing. So especially with Bach and other composers, you'll hear all of these sounds together. The modern concept of Do having the first place, and then these older concepts, these church modes with all these different syllables with different flavors. So you really expand the palette here harmonically with all your options for melodies and for harmonies. So that's one of the big things, JJ.
Yeah, when I first asked Patrick about doing this today, his first instinct was to say, well, why don't I just play some rock music to start us off, and then people will know exactly what Baroque music is. And I think it's a little cheeky, but at the same time, it's really true, because what Patrick said there that's really important is that this foundational element, this idea that like there's a strong harmony, strong bass, and a really strong melody, it's the way that we consume most of the music we consume today. You think of any modern pop song, and that's pretty much how it's laid out. Same thing with the harmony. Okay, so the whole thing, Patrick, do, re, mi, fa, sol, working our way up. That's the way that our songs are structured now today. So it is this date of 1600, the beginning of the Baroque period, is really kind of a watershed moment in our music, both sacred and secular music, because these changes are very, very vast and broad. So, so Patrick, can you talk then? Now we have a little bit of a sense of the theory about how this music has changed and developed. How about some examples of music from the Baroque?
Yeah, so do we want to look at those examples of Handel that I had there?
Sure.
Okay, so before we look at that, so we talked about this desire to make text really clear. That comes from the opera developing. So we want text to be clearly heard and emotions to be clearly expressed, right? So it's this idea of directness. We still have counterpoint and things that you learned about in the Renaissance that does still occur, but the big change is the directness of text. So the ideas of interpreting the text through music is really important. Again, this also happened in the Renaissance, but with things becoming much clearer, it's a little more obvious in this period. So these are kind of just some fun examples here. We'll look at every valley. I'm sure most of us have probably heard Handel's Messiah. Here in America, at least, it's every single Christmas and sometimes Easter, we sing Handel's Messiah everywhere. So I think it's one of the first pieces of music, actually, that has never stopped being performed. Mm-hmm. I think it's one of those pieces that has the longest performance history. It was premiered in the 1700s, and it's never fallen out of favor. It's always been performed. So it's kind of our oldest hit, I think, right?
It's our oldest viral sensation.
Yeah, it's our first viral sensation, right? I think we know that, every valley. So I just want to give you some examples here of how Handel, so this is late Baroque. This is the end of the period we're talking here. So Handel's born in 1685, dies in 1759. So this is the end of the period. But it's pretty fun if you're kind of aware of his desire to create images with the text. You can really hear this stuff come to life. So the text here, every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain be made low, and the crooked straight, and the rough places plain. So there's some big keywords there that you can have a lot of fun with musically, and Handel does this in here. So if we think valleys and mountains, right, we're going to expect images like this that loop, something goes up and down, that creates the image of a mountain. So take a listen to what he does. Of course, the first thing the musical line does is it flies upward as if there's a mountain in a valley, right? So we have, I'm not a tenor, by the way, but I'll sing as best I can here. So every valley, right? So just right there, we fling up into the sky, there's a mountain and there's a valley, right? And then going on, every valley what? Shall be exalted. The word exalting, right? To be raised up. So you'll notice he extends the word exalted onto this kind of free fantasy of pitches. And all of these pitches will keep rising and rising and rising. So it's a real expressive way to depict with one single word, on one single syllable, this idea of being exalted, being raised up. It's pretty obvious, but it's fun to think about when you hear it. So every valley shall be exalted. So here we go. Shall be exalted. Right? So it's just going higher and higher. Some more fun things we have here going on the next page. The mountains are made low, very obvious, right? We'll fling up high for a mountain and then we'll come down low. So here's the line. And every mountain and hill made low. Of course, this is my favorite part. The crooked becomes straight. So just look at the notes there. the crooked straight. Right? It's literally those words in music. The word crooked is crooked, and the word straight is straight. And if you sing that, the crooked straight, right? And the rough place is plain. What do you get on the word plain, flat? You get one single pitch. And the rough place is plain. So it's really obvious things, but it's a lot of fun, and Handel's having fun with this. Can we look at one more, JJ? Because this one I think is even more fun.
Yeah.
And we like sheep.
This
So I
one?
just
Yeah.
give you a few examples here because I think we're all familiar with these pieces. So maybe you could listen to them with different ears if you're looking at the text. Because remember, the goal is direct expression of text. We want to understand this. We want to see the images in our heads as we hear this music. So the text here, all we like sheep have gone astray. So all of us on earth, we're ignoring God. We're not following his plan. We've gone astray is the message of this text, right? All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned to our own ways. So again, this is real obvious stuff, but Handel's having a lot of fun. The first thing you hear musically is I just picture a bunch of little sheep jumping around, right? Happy-go-lucky, carefree sheep doing their own thing, not listening to God as they should be, but they're having a nice time here. And here's the first thing we hear. That's just the bass line, but already you hear them bouncing around, right? And then here we go, the choir enters. All we like sheep. All we like sheep. So there's the sheep. And then what have they done? They've gone astray. And this is almost kind of comical the way it sounds, but the melody line just trails off. It just goes astray. So the sopranos sing, have gone astray. And it just trails off, right? And then the most fun, I think, is on the word turn. He takes that literally. We have turned to our own ways. So he has a lot of fun on this word. In sections, it sounds like this. We have turned. That's all the word turned. If I put it together, it sounds like this. We have turned it. It almost makes you dizzy, right? But you can hear very obviously. So that's a real prominent feature of this music at this time. The desire, especially in Handel. He was kind of a popular composer, whereas Bach composed for himself and for God and didn't necessarily care if people understood his music, per se. Handel was a popular guy who wanted to sell tickets to his operas and to his oratorios, and so it's direct, it's plain, it's amazing, it's beautiful, but it's right in your face and pretty obvious. So take a listen to Handel's Messiah with some different ears and think about the desire to communicate ideas and images in music. It's pretty wonderful.
Yeah, that's one of the best things about Handel too, because it's these ideas that Patrick's explaining here are ever present in music, right? Musical melody, harmony have this incredible capacity to evoke feelings, to point to other ideas that might not be immediately accessible. And Handel makes it so obvious for us that it's kind of like the simple guide to following along in music. I got a great question though, Patrick, actually, that plays right off of this. This person says, as a Catholic who grew up in the church of the 70s and 80s, I did not hear these styles of music at Mass. I did hear them as a college student at University of Notre Dame. As I listened to the music for class prep, I noticed the different emotional responses from each style of music. Do those involved with sacred music choose different styles to use in liturgy to evoke different emotional responses from the congregation? How much freedom do they have in different settings, chorus, parish, educational institutions? But this is great because we are going to talk about the affections anyways, and this is a nice segue.
Yeah, so there's a lot at play there, of course. It depends, of course, on where we're talking. A lot of this I'd say would be cultural. The Catholic Church is the universal church, right? Which that's the beauty of it, I think, is the different ways, in various ways, in the beautiful ways our different cultures can express the same faith in different ways, with different aesthetics, with different musical sounds. So I think that's some of the beauty of the church. So here, for example, in the United States, in South Bend, when we think about that, we consider our community and who we desire to reach out to. So that's something we talk about a lot here. And I know since I've been at Notre Dame myself, even my view on sacred music has changed quite a bit. I grew up in a certain way, and I was used to a certain style that spoke directly to me. But just like throughout life, and we meet different people and we go other places and we learn that people have other perspectives and they experience their faith in different ways, which is beautiful, and which I think is a beautiful picture of the universality of the Catholic Church. So we do think about that. You think about who the people that you're reaching out to respond to the music, where they're coming from, what musics they're used to in their own culture, so with their own backgrounds. So where you're starting from, and then I think if we can all start from a place of understanding and then move to others, move beyond that as well, is always a good thing. So I've been challenged myself to experience other styles of Catholic music since I've been here, and I've grown a lot in that, in what I relate to in sacred music. So I don't know if I'm answering that question, but we do think about it a lot. And the trick is, especially in places where people come, like Notre Dame, from all over the world, you're not necessarily dealing with, one monoculture, for example, which might be easier to do in like a more rural place, where people all have the same experiences growing up with music, so they might relate differently to music. So yeah, that's kind of a big challenge at Notre Dame, I would say, JJ. I don't know if that speaks to you. Yeah, we have, which is a beautiful thing, if we have people from all over the world, and we do want to make them all feel welcome in the Catholic Church through our music, which should be varied and different. What to me won't speak to JJ or speak to someone else necessarily.
Yeah. Yeah, it's some great points there, especially with regard to just how vast the considerations can and need to be, really, for us in liturgy. But I think the other thing I would add is that, are we thinking through how we would like to evoke emotional responses? Of course, because if we can help create an emotional response, and one that is kind of in line with the scripture that we're reading on a particular Sunday, or the thematic elements of a particular feast like Easter, like, of course, that's one of the things that music is uniquely able to do. Music in some ways is able to bypass the intellect and speak right to our hearts sometimes, right? We all know that feeling when we hear the song that we love, and might even not know why we love it, but it just kind of has that ability to speak directly to us. And that sort of power, if you will, comes with a huge responsibility, especially when you're dealing with something like liturgy, because it can be used for the not good intentions also. But when used well, this is one of the reasons I love sacred music so much. When used well, it really carries with it the capacity to invite us more deeply into our faith and more deeply into our relationships with each other. Patrick talked about the ability to extend ourselves beyond what our own impressions might be, or what our own tastes might be. And in doing so, we really open ourselves up to greater relationship with people who aren't like us. So that's one of the really wonderful things about sacred music that I think can inform really our whole aesthetic. I got another question, actually, Patrick, that's cool here about, could you discuss the role of repetition in the Baroque, or repetition with variations, and what type of role does that have here as we move into this Baroque music?
Yeah, that's one of the big changes aesthetically at this time period. So going back to the Renaissance, the prevailing aesthetic was to not repeat things. So basically, you would have a long text, and each little part of the text would be composed with certain musical ideas, and then you move on to the next part of the text with its own musical ideas. And the goal was to have an ever flowing, continuous style of music, generally speaking, that flowed and did not have repetition. there were all these kind of rules as you were composing. You could repeat things, but no more than twice, because after that it's too much. So there were rules in the Renaissance period of how they composed. In the Baroque, the opposite is kind of true. They want, again, because of that directness, these repetitions that keep occurring to keep the listener tied in. So, like that thing I just played by Handel, there's one little idea there, and then he repeats it like 10 times, and so the listener can grasp onto those ideas and go on. So yeah, in Baroque compositions particularly, a piece of music will start, and you'll basically have the same rhythmic patterns as you go through the whole thing, like the Handel piece I played. You basically have those same rhythms for 3 minutes. Then you might move on to a contrasting section, and then you're back to the familiar patterns again. So that's a big development here, again, which continues today. If you listen to any pop song, basically you'll probably be in 4. You'll have 4 beats per measure. And pretty much the first rhythmic ideas you hear in measure number 1 in the first 2 seconds are probably what's going to continue for the next 3 minutes. So again, it's an idea that becomes kind of codified at this time, and it continues today.
Yeah. The other thing repetition does is it establishes a hierarchy in the rhetoric. So if we're talking, in the Renaissance, we might have like a paragraph of text and it's going to flow all the way through. We want to create an undisturbed experience of union with God in a mystical sense, right? In the Baroque, we're much more engaged intellectually, or we're hoping to be, right? This is concurrent and after the Age of Enlightenment, right? And so what we're interested in is being able to emphasize particular elements of the text that we think, these things can be subversive even, right? Like right now we're working on a Passion, which we'll talk about next week with students from the folk choir. And so many of the ideas in the Passion, right? So Jesus's Last Supper, really up to his crucifixion, are very subversive, very, very difficult to deal with. And so one of the things that music allows us to do is to point out these things that might be more difficult to just hear for the first time. You might be able to kind of build a bridge, invite someone in a little bit more hospitably to a difficult idea. So yeah, just those are some of the ideas that start to emerge in the Baroque with regard to repetition. It's much more explicit though, and I appreciate the question because it's a great observation. There's another good question. They just keep rolling in. So thank you all for your questions, and please keep asking us. We're glad to help this fireside chat serve you in whatever way is most helpful. Can you articulate more the relationship and reciprocal influences between sacred and profane music or secular music during the Baroque and up to today? So very loaded question, but we could probably avoid a lot of the tension if we start with the Baroque and then maybe find our way to the present.
So the questions about the influences, how they speak to one another back and forth?
Reciprocal influences between sacred and secular music.
Yeah. So the first thing that I thought of when I heard that was the Oratorio. So that's a form that comes out at this time. That's Handel's Messiah is an oratorio. So if we're familiar with opera, so opera, basically the first opera is around 1600. This opera Eurydice by Peri is notably known as the first opera. What is an opera? Everyone in Italy knows, but opera, is basically a sung play. It's a drama that instead of being spoken is sung, and it was became very popular. And by the time we get to Handel, he's a German. He studies in Italy. He learns all his techniques there, but then he goes and lives the rest of his life, 30 plus years in England, and he imports this Italian opera, the secular popular style of opera, to Italy. And that is all the rage for years. He's able to survive on that. And after a while, it kind of goes bust, right? And people are over it. And
actually, if I can interrupt, Handel studied in Rome also for a little while. That's where he wrote his Oratorio La Resurrezione, which will be appropriate next week.
Yeah. And Dixie Dominus, another awesome piece if you don't know it.
Yeah.
Check that one out, Dixie Dominus. But yeah, so Handel's in England, right? These operas, these secular operas are popular. Eventually, people are tired of it. Um, and so he needs another way to make money. At the same time, so thinking of sacred influences, during Lent, we're familiar with restricting things, fasting from things. So entertainments are basically, forbidden throughout Europe during the period of Lent. So operas are off the table for Lent. We can't have opera anymore. But kind of the loophole here is the oratorio. The oratorio is basically an opera. It's a drama, but it's from biblical texts, right? So Handel's Messiah is a biblical drama, basically, depicting scenes of Christ's life, more or less. Um, and so there's kind of one thing that came to mind. There's Handel being pragmatic. He also needs to put bread on the table, but he's taking his skills as a secular composer of popular operas and transforming them into a sacred style of oratorio. That, of course, still is different than liturgical music, which we haven't talked too much about. So you wouldn't sing that at Catholic Mass, for example. It was still more of an entertainment. But there's one thing that comes to mind as far as a whole genre really becoming popular because of things like that. Which, of course, the oratorio begins in Italy as well. So.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the one place I can address this question from is it's from Rome, at least in the early 17th century. We kind of see this flourishing of really all music, both sacred and secular. And what we find too is that the musicians probably and most likely are the same musicians who are playing for the secular things and playing for the sacred things. Now, these probably aren't the same people who are crafting it or conceptualizing or conceiving the environments that the music happens in. But just imagine, it's like, if someone asks me to go, play a concert at a club or go play at Mass on Sunday, and I'm still the same person. So a lot of the stylistic stuff is going to carry over. And so these two streams can't help but influence each other in that context. And I think Patrick makes a good distinction there too, just about the difference between liturgical music and the difference between something more like devotional music, I would call it, which I think something like an oratorio would fall into. This is music that is meant to edify the faithful, but not necessarily in a liturgical context. So that's one of the, at least in the early Baroque, that's one of the hotbeds. I talked about it in my video, I think, but that's one of the hotbeds for innovation, because during these Lenten periods where opera can't happen, there's a great need. People want to be entertained. They're used to being entertained, right? So where can we find some way to engage in a meaningful way? Come to the church, beautiful music. It's being told through the lens of scripture, through popular devotion, and it again, it's a way for people to engage in their faith during a time when some of those excesses are cut off, as they are currently. So cool. I think we have time for a couple more questions here, and they're just rolling in. So was Baroque music played in churches during Lent, or would they go back to monophonic music, as Margot taught us would be the case in the Renaissance? And just so that you have a little context, Patrick, last week we talked about, before the Baroque period, during parts of the Renaissance and earlier, during Lent, there would be no music in part of the liturgy. So do you know, I'm not really sure about this question, but
Yeah, that's kind of complicated. I'm not sure specifically about Lent, but I do know that things were not so centralized back then. Even the rites that we would pray, at this point, I think things became more centralized, but for a while, even the rites themselves could differ from country to country, location to location, and the musical practices did as well. Um, for example, in France, so everywhere we would be used to using Gregorian chant in the Catholic Church, more or less. Those styles would change from country to country, but in France, for example, a tradition came out where you would share the chant between the organist and the choir. So the choir might sing a few phrases, Gloria in excelsis Deo or something the choir would sing, and then the organ would play and respond with Et in terra pax, and peace to people on earth. So that was a specific tradition that happened in France that was totally different than other countries. There weren't other countries or many other places that had this tradition of actually breaking up the text, where the choir sings the text and then the organ sings the text, and then we go back and forth. So things like that could differ wildly from region to region. So yeah, I'm not sure specifically about what was prohibited during Lent and if it would come directly to Rome and go to every single country, in the Catholic world. Again, things traveled slower then. It was much harder to have centralized things. So I might imagine that that would differ from place to place. But that's
Yeah.
a good question for a historian, musicologist, which I am not.
Yeah. Another great question. And this is one of the things Patrick and I talked about actually before we met today. But did sacred music first move to context beyond the Mass in this period, like in the Baroque period? For example, concerts or private devotions. I'm thinking of both oratorios like Messiah and works derived from the Mass ordinary and propers that became impractical for liturgical use. And I think we could talk a little bit about this just from the perspective. I mean, we'll start to get into some ideas that are more relevant in the classical period, which we won't cover in this course, but kind of the democratization of music performance and its separation from very specific orders in which it takes place, like in the Mass, for example, or as part of like a royal court, right? And these types of things start to break down here towards the end of the Baroque.
Yeah, I'll have to think about what kind of examples we could talk about, but that all depends on what context we're speaking. Because you're right, there's sacred music in the church for people to hear at Mass. There's sacred music that some sort of monarch might be paying for, some sort of patron for their private, aristocratic chapel. And then, especially in the evangelical and the Lutheran traditions at this time, there's a real push for home devotions and hymnals and things like that, where a family might own one single hymnal, and that's what they bring to church, and that's what they use at home. And so, Bach, for example, has a whole book of hymn settings. I'm gonna forget the name now, but of like a couple hundred hymns that are just simply harmonized with a melody and a keyboard part. And the idea was you could take that book home and sing that with your family. So it wasn't for Mass or for the Lutheran liturgy. Again, I don't know much about what was going on with the Catholic devotions at that time and private devotions. But again, it all depends on what we're talking about, what context. Home, royal courts, churches, Catholic churches sponsored by Rome, evangelical Lutheran churches that are independent. I don't know, JJ, anything you can think of on that? That's a good question,
Yeah,
though.
it is a good question. Yeah, the only thing I could think of, like kind of in the context of our trajectory here over the last couple of weeks, is that like we talked a lot about, or at least with Peter in our first week, we talked about this sort of coexistence of these traditions that happened in monasteries and traditions that happened more like in cathedrals and city centers, and that these traditions were in some ways exclusive at first, right? You have a religious order that is developing music for the sake of, firstly, their own liturgies, but also for their own religious devotion. So in my imagination, at least, I'm kind of thinking, well, yeah, there's probably quite a bit of development of that music that doesn't happen exclusively within the Mass. I think much of what we have as records of those things are parts of the ordinary of the Mass and things like that. But yeah, it is a good question, just kind of about, where does this shift happen? Because it most certainly happens in a much more developed way as we get later into the Baroque period and into the classical period. So I would say there's one more question, little piece here, just about the Dixie Dominus. Someone says, can you talk about the achingly beautiful dissonances, especially in De Torrente and Via Vivet? But I don't know this piece well, so I thought that would make you smile, Patrick.
Yeah, I can't remember what what text is where, but it's a piece that Handel wrote really at a younger age. I think he was in his teens. I'm just remembering from years ago. Maybe he was like 18 or something. It's just a really amazing piece that's full of really intense drama and driving rhythms, which you can really hear, like how, in my opinion, like it relates to modern music or like rock with this driving rhythms. And yeah, it's for I think 5 or 6 part choir with full of these intense dissonances. And
Yeah,
if we send some links later, I'll send a link of a nice recording. It's an
cool.
amazing kind of Latin text that gives you a cool overview of all these rhythms and melodic ideas and text painting ideas we've been talking about.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, it's such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for all of your thoughtful preparation and sharing your excitement with us today. Um, just an honor to be here with you on this call. I'm going to pass it over now to Sylvia, who will tell us about our small groups and finish out the session.
Thanks, JJ. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, JJ. Wonderful. Truly inspiring and very clear. And we've learned a lot, I think. Thank you. Thank you both. Yes, as you, JJ, just mentioned, we're now getting ready to go into breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. There are some prompts for discussions that were provided by our speakers. I'll read them for you right now. The first one is, what differences struck you most between Renaissance and Baroque music? And the second prompt is, what do you see as the pros and cons of the changes that we see taking place towards the end of Renaissance and into the Baroque? Think about the use of vernacular language, very direct presentation of text, for instance. So we're getting ready now to go into the breakout session, and as always, we expect everybody to follow the rules of civic discourse and to respect each other's comments. Please note that if you choose not to participate in the breakout rooms, you may leave the meeting and join us again next week. JJ will be here with this choir next week. I don't know, JJ, if you want to say a couple of words about what we can expect for next week.
Yeah, next week's going to be very exciting. We're working on this very long range and far-reaching project on the Passion. We're creating a new setting, and we'll have some of our most involved students. I think 4 or 5 of them will join us, as well as the poet who's writing the libretto. And the students have been hard at work preparing a very nice presentation and conversation for our time together next week. So looking forward to that.
Wonderful. Thank you.